Well, um, usually, in fact always, before these programs, one or two articles comes out in the Lake Report that's related to what's coming up. And this, none of the articles I had written or wanted in the paper had to deal with this. So I think that's probably part of the reason why we are where we are. But I will tell you that for those who were here last week, it was one of the best ones because there were even fewer. And it was great because we could have a conversation. And it's difficult to do when you have more than 10 or 12 people in a group, so it was actually a lot of fun. So this week is, this week we're talking about the life and when did life begin and how did it begin. And we could short circuit this whole coming 40 or 50 minutes by saying, we don't know. But I would cheat you from, and myself, from all the details in between. The fact is we do know a fair bit, but do we actually know how life started and where it started? The answer is no, and if you think about it, I mean, Earth is, the sun is about 5 billion years old, rounding it out. Earth's 4.5. Maybe the earliest life that people kind of quibble about, the evidence in Australia would be 3.7 billion years. But hell, the Earth was no great place to be for the first 100 million or billion and a half, even extended out to 2 billion years. Why? Because the atmosphere was 98% carbon dioxide. It was, if you weren't being hammered by rocks from space accretion, the building up of Earth, the Great Bombardment, which went on a long time, temperatures of 300 degrees centigrade or higher, there isn't going to be any recognizable life, at least that we would recognize. And so no atmosphere to build on, and a very bare, hot, very unpleasant planet with zero oxygen. So, in fact, it took about, I'll get into this a little bit later, but it took almost 2 billion years before anything that we would recognize as a life-friendly planet evolved. And there was oxygen. So that was the great oxygenation event. So we'll talk briefly about that. And the other thing is, let's face it, early life would have been very fragile, certainly not looked like any single cells that we recognize now that are already quite complex. A bacteria is very complex. May not look it under the microscope, but it is. And so it must have taken a long time to evolve into that. And the chances of finding some remains of something far more primitive, if you like, just about zero. So are we going to, in this hour, show you earliest life? No, and for a very good reason. But there is a story, and this whole series is about creation stories. So this is number 2. Well, I always have a slide like this to kind of put people in a time frame. So there's the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, the formation of the sun, Earth's formation, beginning of life, 3.7. It could have been earlier than that for sure, and but it was a long time before mammals came along. They're 220 million years. By the way, that asteroid hit Earth at 66 million years ago, and mammals and the first primates were already present. And enough of them survived, or we wouldn't be here having this discussion. And Homo sapiens, certainly 100,000 years ago, maybe a stretch to push it back to 200,000 years ago. If you were a visitor from outer space and orbiting the Earth, what would be the evidence for life? Well, it certainly wouldn't look like much. I mean, our early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and the rest, first of all, there weren't many of them. Maybe worldwide max, say anywhere between 100,000 to 1 million. So not many. And they weren't doing much that you could see. I mean, they didn't look a lot different than the other animals. And they weren't creating stuff that would tell you, gee, this is an intelligent group, unless you went into some of the caves 50,000 years ago. So you wouldn't have, you might have made many, many trips back to Earth to kind of find, gee, is there intelligent life there? Well, for all but maybe the last 100,000 years, but 55 or 50 or 60,000 years ago would be a better bet. There wouldn't be much to show for us, and we might not know. So that adds a little perspective to this. Well, the other thing is about life is carbon-based. Carbon is the key, what I've likened to the matriarchal element. Life's elements are simple. There they are, carbon or hydrogen, which is there from the Big Bang. All the rest, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and a tiny bit of sulfur, were made in stars. So all of those life-friendly elements, save hydrogen, were products of stars, of fusion of increasingly larger, more complex nuclei, generating a lot of energy. And then when the star kind of broke down or ended its life, those elements were then shed into space and were available to be gobbled up by the next star to form. For example, our sun is the third in a series. Not in the same place, but certainly the same region of the Milky Way. So what we're going to talk about are those top two here, but one of the themes here is to realize that we all have common roots. Every single species that's ever been, that we have any record of, has exactly the same mix of atoms and elements. So from the very beginning, or close to the very beginning, and the same families of molecules, meaning RNA, then DNA, proteins, sugars, fatty acids, and that kind of thing. So we can't trace all of that far back, but it's clear that the building blocks, the building materials, have remained exactly the same. And what dictated that? Physics. So if you've been attending the Nobel series, you have maybe some grasp of some of the rules, nature's rules, of how these atoms actually interact. They actually self-organize. It doesn't require somebody to organize them. If you put hydrogen close to any of those other atoms there, they will form bonds. They will form into simple carbon-based molecules. And molecules that eventually became RNA, DNA, proteins, and fatty compounds that form the lipid membranes. So we have all the makings really based on self-assembly. It doesn't require a watchmaker. Okay, so that's an important thing. And also to realize that we are related to everyone. I mean, we may be bashing each other's heads around the world, and so our species is far and away the worst than any other species at any time. And just look at the current world right now. And yet, at that deep root, we're all related. And we're related to almost to every species that's ever been, however distant that connection is, and the same atoms and molecules are involved. That's a really important thing to grasp, because humans have this exceptionalism thing. We're top dog. Well, we are, in a bad way. We kind of dominate the earth and are busily destroying it, and the atmosphere and the oceans and the rest of it. And we are very bright for sure, but the one thing that hasn't changed, we're very tribalistic. And we're very protective, and we're argumentative and territorial, and that hasn't changed as far as I can see one whit, except the weapons have become more powerful. So that doesn't make me. So, well, even back in the 1700s and 1800s with the Industrial Revolution, people were building railways and more roads, and guess what they found out when they went down layer by layer? In some areas, they were rich, the areas were rich in fossils. But going down deeper and deeper, the fossils were earlier and earlier, and later versions heaped on top, right? And hence you have this curious business of marine animals, abundant marine animals these days in the Alps, or shark's teeth sticking out of stones in Tuscany. And how did that happen? Because land masses or tectonic plates collided and essentially pushed up, in the case of the Alps, what was underwater. That's why the marine animals are several thousand feet up in the Alps. And by the way, they were pretty astute back in the 1800s by looking around the world, and the order of the fossils is exactly the same everywhere. They didn't have ways of dating them, but they certainly relative timing. They were, it was possible in those days. So it's a really interesting thing. So let's. Anyway, these are all kind of sources of creation stories. The striking thing is, for humans, it is amazing what our species has learned about ourselves and the world we live in just in the last century. And that trajectory is going up steeper and steeper, because there are many more people involved. China's now on board. If you look at the record in China, just the last 20 years, of any study of the best institutions in science, writ wide or broad, China's clambered from 0 in the top 100 to vying for the top ones. And in our AI, they outnumbered the US. That's as recently in the last year or so. The point I'm making is that humans behave as a collective. I mean, we have our own brain, but because we share that knowledge widely, or the knowledge that we accrue is shared so widely, we really become a super organism. That's really unique. There's no other species that works like that. And we haven't worked like that probably since, well, maybe the beginnings of that, say 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, that kind of collective intelligence and learning, meaning generations sharing information from generation to generation, and certainly speeded up with writing. But now, these days, the internet and the ready source of knowledge, and I mean, YouTube and places like it, it's kind of the Wild West, a lot of junk. But there's a lot of really good stuff if you know who to listen to and what their credentials are. However, I'm getting off So here's the shark's teeth, or what it might have looked like in Tuscany. Now, we just have the teeth kind of sticking out in Tuscany, in a nice wine area. I don't know what the elevation of Tuscany is, but it must be up, what, 2,000 feet or something like that. So obviously the land has risen a lot. And then there's another spectacular example of this huge thing. I mean, there's so many of these. I mean, the geological record is just replete with this stuff, wherever you look, if you have the eyes to see it and the tools to see it. And all of this unknown, or almost unknown, until recent centuries. So just hold on a second. Anyway. Well, here's an operating principle I have in my life. If you want to understand something, go to the beginning. If you want to understand what's going on in Ukraine, what are the roots to that? And you need to go back a long time. And going back makes it easier too, because it's simpler. I mean, the longer the time goes by, the more complicated the story becomes. But there are roots. And the Middle East is another perfect example of that. Here we have the Abrahamic religions all hammering one another. But they have a common stem root. And it's not very old. It's 5,000 years old altogether. I'm speaking about Mr. Abraham. And who I'm not sure existed, but anyway. And this is certainly true when it comes to the business of life, which we'll get into today, but let me see. Well, these kind of things, how do you figure out the roots? Well, in the last century, when radioactivity, Madame Curie and her successors realized that some atoms were unstable and they broke down, decayed, but they decayed at a precise schedule, very precise, enough that you could date things in the past quite precisely. And if you were looking at any particular species, let's just take a modern, let's take humans. The tree of life lasts 5 or 6 billion years to us. What would you look at? Well, the obvious one is how big is the cranium, but also the shape of the cranium, because that reflects which lobes are relatively bigger than others. And for human cognition and emotional control, it's the frontal and temporal lobes, which incidentally are smaller in Neanderthals, relatively speaking, than us. And so that's part of it. But the other thing is, what did they eat? Well, you can tell that from the jaw muscles, because if they're foraging really tough stuff to chew and break up, they're going to have big jaws, big jaw muscles, and big molars. And then as humans evolve, and even as recently as the last few thousand years, teeth get smaller. Molars, not every kid has, a second or third molar. These days, my daughter told me that, even in comparison with 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So that's evolution on the fast track in response to changes in diet. So there must be stimuli that jaw, that developing jaw that was budding teeth, and in response to the pressure exerted, that kind of thing, it essentially turns on the building of the tooth. And if it doesn't have that stimulus, it doesn't form. So if you eat soft stuff from get-go, you might not have any teeth. So my daughter says. It helps to know a lot about the prevailing climate, and we lose sight of the fact. I mean, it wasn't all, geologically speaking, it wasn't all so long ago. You look at North Africa, and all kinds of oases and rivers and lakes in Saudi Arabia, and on a regular cycle. Every kind of 100,000 years plus or minus 10,000 or 10,000, 20,000 years. There's this cycle. What dictates that? The orbit of the Earth around the Sun, which changes because of changes in the gravitational effects of all of the planets on the Earth changing its orbit. So isn't that amazing that the weather we have, or climate, better word than weather. Weather is an everyday thing. Climate is a long-term thing. That climate that we live in is dictated by the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, and very predictably so. This is extraordinary. It's kind of a big picture, isn't it? And the genome, the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2020 for that kind of stuff. What's really new now is that the genes don't last long, particularly in places like Africa, because of climate. But proteins do. Proteins last, many hundreds of thousands of years. So now people are turning to looking at proteins as a way of mapping the evolution of some of the biochemistry of us, and it's a really good tool. If you're looking for stuff left behind, even that has become a big deal. I mean, listen, it wasn't so long ago, let's say 100 years ago, when it was a big deal to find Neanderthal, the first Neanderthal in Germany. But it's all based on usually a skull or a relatively preserved fossil. By the way, fossil means the bone has become mineralized. That's what it is. But there wasn't much in the way of artifacts left behind. So unless they left the toolbox that they used to live, and the weapons that they had, how would you know how intelligent they were? And that's why, for example, South Africa has been so rich, and because Blue Boss Cave and Pinnacle Peak have been the gift that keeps giving. And so you go back, say, 90,000, 100,000 years, and what do you find? A little artist's place where there are little kits of ochre and other pigments for kind of mixing, breaking them up and mixing them. And a little wall art, that kind of thing. Nothing like Europe 50,000 years later, but still. So little inklings. They obviously had enough time to do it. They must have had enough leisure time to actually do this kind of stuff. So what else were they doing? And then the other thing is, why did they drop out? Because they were 100,000 years ago, and then silence until 77,000 years ago, and stuff reappears in the same places. So what does this tell us? We have been a fragile species, like many other species. We come and go, and if the weather really turns sour on us, or the climate kind of changes in a significant way, we're small in number. They're relatively small groups. We probably don't cooperate with too many other groups. In any case, they're distant from us. So we're vulnerable. So extinction was almost the order of the day. And so new groups had to relearn some of these skills. They weren't passed on to somebody because there was no one there to share it with, that kind of knowledge. So, or those people died off. So, interesting stuff, isn't it? Well, I already did that. Okay. Well, and look at this. We wouldn't have done anything like this. And this is just two. I mean, hundreds of satellites have gone up. And but the James Webb Telescope, and I cannot imagine in the current political climate anyone in the current government having the imagination or the will or even interest in continuing stuff like this. We have built up an amazing structure in science, and it's international. And it's now under serious threat. I mean, if you kick the foundation out of stuff like this, it doesn't hang around. And but there's the Hubble telescope, just comparing this out. The point I want to make about the James Webb telescope is look at the temperature, operating temperature, that's how cold it gets. 1 million miles away from Earth, way out there. And why is it in that position? So, so if you turn the satellite, the telescope here, you can focus on particular stars, and because ancient stars, they've been moving away at a great speed, and they're red shifted into the infrared range, and if you don't have a filter on it, that the Hubble telescope didn't, then you miss it. So you might have been looking at an area of sky that was dark, but you put in a red filter, and all of a sudden it comes alive. And you realize there's a whole lot more out there than you had any idea about. So, it's important stuff. I'm sorry, I did that. You think I learned that lesson? Now, I'm going to leave this one up because it's really important. Because, let's say you're in Maine. No, that might be. Let's say you're in Alaska or Northern Ontario, and it's a great night. There's no external light interference. And you look up, and it's a summer, and it's a perfectly clear sky. There are no clouds, no weather, no nothing. And what do you see? It's pitch black, or very, very close to black blue. And millions, and countless little dots of light, the odd comet. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you don't see these pictures here. There's too much atmospheric pollution here to see it in the Golden Triangle. The point is, if you look at that same empty space, but you put a filter on it, all of a sudden you see these great gaseous clouds, enormous clouds, hundreds of light years apart. I mean, they are enormous. One variety are these interstellar space. They're just jam-packed with carbon-based chemicals, all the chemicals of life. Carbon and hydrogen, and oxygen and nitrogen. Not so much phosphorus. So they're all there. The building blocks are right there. And furthermore, they form compounds, molecules, by themselves. They don't need divine intervention or whatever else going on. And then there are these other gigantic molecular clouds. These are the nurseries for stars. So this is, they contain a lot of hydrogen, some helium, a tiny, tiny bit of lithium, and if there had been stars that kind of came to their natural end and they exploded, then any elements heavier elements that they created are scattered in the neighborhood to be gobbled up by a newly formed star in that area. Follow what I'm saying? So it's important to realize that what looked like empty space is anything but. It's jam-packed with stuff. And it's jam-packed with stuff, the elements that are directly related to life, as we know it. So that's important. And as Charles Cocknell put it in a great book, one of my favorites, The Physics of Life, how do you put it, are already some way along the path to being useful precursors to energy yielding and metabolic pathways of living things. So right out in space, never mind being on Earth, the compounds, a lot of this structure more complex structure has started. Sorry, God, how many times can we do that? And now here's the James Webb Telescope. Without an infrared filter, this would all look like this. But with the filter, you see these gigantic clouds. I mean, this cloud, like from here to there, would be maybe 10 or 100 times the distance to Andromeda, our nearest galaxy. So they are huge, yes.
Yeah, could you just explain, because I'm very stupid.
No, you're not.
If you have you're looking at the sky, the down without a filter.
Yeah, without the filter.
So what is the filter doing to produce that?
It's only allowing through radiation in the infrared range. It's filtered out all the other stuff.
Okay, so it's filtered out stuff.
Yeah, that highlights what's left.
Okay.
And this is the very early, now what is early in the universe? Early stars. It's not 13.8 billion years ago at the time of the Big Bang. The earliest that we've really spotted are, say, 800 million years after the Big Bang. But the James Webb Telescope, they're trying to find earlier ones. So it's still a bit of a mystery what actually, for that first half a billion years, what the hell was going on? And it's not on because I turned it off. So I can say what I want. And here's another one. I mean, it's really stunning to look at. If you go on there in the internet and you just go to James Webb Telescope, I mean, there are hundreds of these kind of pictures. I mean, people are really interested in this stuff because it kind of takes them into really a very, very different space than they're used to. So, sorry. God, I think I make this mistake more often than not. Now, here's a supernova, right? This is the time when a star is running out of, not entirely, but running out of hydrogen as a fuel to fuse and create the helium, and the energy to kind of keep the planet or keep the star expanding enough to avoid collapsing. But if it doesn't have enough energy to maintain that expansion, the force of gravity causes the star to implode on itself. And literally, the outer layers smash into this dense core, and that energy creates even heavier elements. But it's quite an extraordinary. These supernovae are very great, very important markers in space because they're very bright, so you can see them from a great distance, and they become markers for distance. And also because if you spectroscopically examine them, you can tell which elements are out there were created by that supernova. That's really very important.
Why would they not all create the same elements? Why would there be?
Well, they do create the same elements, but depending on the size of the star and how violent it is, and how intense those pressures are that are created by the collapse. Meaning, to make middleweight elements combine to form even much heavier ones takes enormous pressure, and that takes a really giant star with a lot of mass.
Supernova.
In fact, a supernova or a kilonova, which is a whole other order. For example, I think I mentioned this last week, if any of you have gold on, the gold was produced by kilonovas.
I've never heard
And
that.
neutron stars, 2 neutron stars, literally made of neutrons. And they're all jam-packed together, the densest object in the universe. And if 2 of them collide, you can imagine what that does. Well, it creates the heaviest elements in the universe, and one of them is gold. So any gold in here has been made in the stars. I love this one. This is a bright guy, this Russian. 1869, he works out the periodic table. And columns that are the vertical columns are elements with similar properties. And they have a weight. Now, they didn't know about electrons, they didn't know about protons or neutrons at that time, but they knew that these elements had different masses. Okay, so they're arranged, there's water over here. So go over to the elements of life, look at how they're all collected together. There's carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those are all the elements of life. And hydrogen, up there, the top left. They're all collected together. And these are relatively simple elements. They bond readily with one another. Some people, Star Trek, imagined life with silicone, at least in a couple of episodes, but silicone probably wouldn't work. But now, there are other elements. After all, we have lots of potassium, sodium, as ions, calcium in our body, but the bulk are those. So that's important. And life everywhere is the same and in the same proportion. Well, you can see how this building might. You begin with the building block atoms. They combine with one another to form the molecules of life. So the atoms are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. They form molecules, bases, nitrogen groups, sugar groups, which combine to form nucleotides, which are the code in DNA and RNA, right? The base. It's the order of those bases in the molecule that dictate what is going to be the function of the gene. And let me just move on here. Oh yeah, I like this one. Yeah, I know it looks terribly complicated. The only thing I want you to look at, just look at, this is the double helix. But look at this. Just look at the elements here. They are exactly what we talked about. So here's the base, thymine. Here, if you look at it, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen. They're all in the group. And then over here, the sugar group, these are all carbon ones here, except an oxygen group here. And then you look at this phosphate group, it's phosphorus surrounded by four oxygens. Yet you have the base. You have the base and then these two groups together form the structure, the ladder. If this were a ladder, they're forming whatever the sides of the ladder are. It's the base. It's these bases. It's the sequence and selection of these bases that determine, or at least where information is stored in RNA and DNA. So that's what I wanted you to see. We're not talking about any other elements. And if I had another picture up here showing fatty acids and phospholipids, I'd find the same mix of atoms. And if I did the same thing for proteins, I'd find the same thing. So I'm driving the point home that certain elements are really important. I'll go back here. But when, how, and where did life begin? Well, was Earth, like all the other planets, seeded from space? Well, could have been. I don't know. I don't know how you answer that one. What they have found is that asteroids contain some amino acids, and recently discovered a nucleotide, meaning a combination of the base and the phosphate group, and to form the nucleotide. It gets a little tricky here. Where's the energy source to do all of this? Well, we'll talk about that in just a second. In Darwin, in the mid 1880s, his imagination, he thought that life would probably have started in kind of warm pools, surface pools of water. But it's probable that the origin is really in deep sea vents near volcanoes. Well, you know, where tectonic plates come together and join, you are going to get volcanoes, right? They're colliding with one another, right? And so volcanoes, and so enormous energy will be there, and a lot of hot water, even, you know, kind of a mile down or half a mile down in the ocean. The temperatures the water's boiling, and hydrogen is being released, and it forms a kind of like a battery, which provides the energy. So you don't need a cell membrane initially, because there are little crevices, about cell-sized crevices in this rock, which acts like a membrane. And then this kind of this battery source for the energy, this ionic one, so-called proton pump. So we don't know, because it's hard to resolve that. Well, we've already been there. And now, the Great Oxidation Event. I told you earlier that for the first 2 billion years, or close to the first 2 billion years, there were organisms, single cells, but they were anaerobic, meaning their biochemistry did not depend on oxygen, right? And then a whole family of organisms, single cell organisms, like so-called cyanobacteria, evolved in, I'm not sure in response to what pressures, but nonetheless they did. And their great gift was the ability to convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. And so little by little, more and more oxygen was added over hundreds of millions of years. And the whole basis of life changed. We would not be here without oxygen. Oxygen is a far more efficient way to generate energy, and would support a complex animal like us. And these cyanobacteria, I mean, they're stacked. I mean, several feet or meters of these layers of these cyanobacteria. You can see them in cliffs in Scotland and some parts of the UK and in Europe. They're not hard to find. Australia, where just jam-packed with dead cyanobacteria. And so now I put together this a little bit. This is my thing, so I'll get over here, so I don't know if you read this stuff out here, but I am going to do it. You have porous catalytic rock. Catalytic meaning it speeds up chemical reactions. So porous catalytic rock through which hydrogen bubbled, creating these proton pumps. What's a proton? Well, protons are hydrogen. Hydrogen has one proton. And if you kind of boost it to a higher energy level, then it acts like a battery, or it can act as a battery. And it's not organic, it's inorganic, but it provides a source of energy. That provided the energy to combine carbon dioxide and water to form organic compounds of increasing complexity. And bases, now of course you're really clued in here, bases and phosphate groups, which together form nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA. And if you're down to RNA, you can make copies of yourself. You can provide templates for proteins. It also catalyzes chemical reactions. You are well on your way to complex life, at least at the cellular level. So that's what that great oxygenation event did. There are three families of kind of single cells. The simplest are bacteria and archaea, and these simple ones here, the DNA or RNA or both, just kind of free floating in the cytoplasm, but they became increasingly complex as time went by. And then a critical development was the fact that probably many times some of these ate some of these, or gobbled them up, incorporated them within themselves. And that meant that in one stream, plants had chloroplasts capable of harnessing the sun to create energy for the plant and for converting CO2 into oxygen, right? Great thing for a plant to be able to do. And that's why we like the Amazon, right? The Amazon basin. We have great forests that are capable of converting CO2, which we don't want, into oxygen, which we do want. And I'm compressing a lot of stuff into a short time. The point is that the modern day, when you look down a microscope these days at archaea or bacteria, they are far too complex to have represented the original early cells. And they were probably the original ones were much more, far fewer genes, 900 in the case of ancient archaea, where that's a guess. And so is the guess at the number of genes in ancient bacteria versus modern E. coli, 4,000 to 5,000 or 6,000. So these cells became more and more complex with time. And if you look at eukaryotic cells in us, we have 24,000 protein encoding genes. So the complexity is moving along. Oh, sorry. Well, along the way, some people thought, well, can we actually make these building blocks? And Miller, about 30 or 40 years ago, managed to create amino acids, and he combined methane, the CH4, ammonia, and hydrogen, and then shot electricity through it. And lo and behold, you got a little dark smudge, and the dark smudge was made up of amino acids. The trouble is, his model for the original atmosphere is wrong. Because early Earth was probably created by, well, as I mentioned to you earlier, carbon dioxide. Look at that, 95% of the atmosphere was carbon dioxide, with very little ammonia. But you like the idea, and then later, not the same lab, but another lab, was able to create nucleotides, meaning the building blocks for genes. So that was very important. So going on. Well, this is a little bit of honesty here. So when and precisely how did life begin? Well, I don't know, no one else knows. It gets really kind of fudgy. But I would guess this, and others would say the same thing. It certainly wasn't with anything as complex as what we see now under the microscope as bacteria. They're far too complex, they're far too developed. But, however life began, it needn't have been fully kitted out to begin with, or even efficient. Just enough to get by. Perhaps the first step were self-assembling nucleotides, those bases, which strung together could replicate themselves, provide templates for other molecules, da-da-da-da-da-da. But the main thing is, life had millions of years to figure this out. Millions and millions of years. That's why it succeeded.
I don't know whose brain it was that did the figuring though. I don't know whose brain did the figuring.
Well, that's a whole other matter. That's, but it's an interesting one. But it would certainly, and it's true of, say, human evolution in the last 5 to 6 million years, it certainly, we never arrived fait accompli in a wrapped package, complete and ready to go. We clearly evolved, and it was been a very complex process getting from 5 or 6 million years ago to where we are now. And every species before us has gone extinct. And we haven't been around all that long. So, sorry, back to the code. So, well, I'll just finish on this because Winston Churchill, I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill for a lot of reasons. Was he a flawless person? No. Is anyone flawless? But, you know, he's extraordinary because just from the eyes of scientists, he was amazing. I don't think there's been a British cabinet since that's had as many bona fide scientists in the cabinet. Now, mind you, it was a wartime cabinet. But his interest in science antedates that by a lot. And he wrote a lot of stuff. He knew scientists. His friends, several of his best friends were leading scientists. He was quite clued in. And he wrote an article which was in Science, the Journal of Science, just a few years ago, which was resurrected. And it was written in the late 1930s. Now listen, this reads very modern here. With hundreds of thousands of nebulae, that would mean galaxies, each containing thousands of millions of suns, the odds are enormous that there must be immense numbers which possess planets where circumstances would not render life impossible. Interestingly, English way of saying that at the end. Well, he was definitely ahead of his time. Sorry. Well, here, just look at the numbers. And so conservative estimates, and these are conservative, this stuff came out a couple of years ago, that there are approximately 300,000 habitable planets in our galaxy. Now, we've only identified, I think, up to 4,000, but that's in our little corner of the Milky Way. If you take the whole Milky Way, and we apparently are an average-sized nebula or galaxy, there are 300,000 habitable planets. If you then take the fact that there are at least 2 trillion galaxies, then just do the math. You count the zeros. And that only accounts for 5% of the known or visible universe, not the other 95% that's so far away from us now that we can't see any light coming from it. So, does life exist elsewhere? Absolutely. I mean, if you want it on record, yes, and in many, many places. And given the numbers, there's got to be intelligent life.
Transparent.
Yeah, and this has huge implications in my thinking, way I think about life. because it's very easy to get all tied up with what surrounds us and our importance as a species, that kind of thing. But realize that, you know, we will never meet these people because of the limits of the speed of light. We will never see them. Now, that's why they were digging around on Mars. At least you can get there. But you're not going to find somebody walking on Mars or doing what we do. But it's more than that, because left out of that remember I showed you the first slide of that series? There was a red dwarf with a habitable planet. Red dwarfs are quite common in galaxies. Now, what it does mean is that, and they often have rocky planets orbiting them close enough that if they had water, you would have liquid water, and you would have an atmosphere. If there's a rub in that, there may be too much radiation from the red dwarf. But the point is that I think just on the numbers alone, I know people get cute about this because no one wants to be called a fool or anything like that. But do I believe? That's almost a religious answer. Do I believe that there's life elsewhere? Absolutely. Do I think there's intelligent life the equal of us or more? Absolutely. So in the series, next week the next two are interesting. The first traces our ancestry. Now, we're not going back billions of years. We're going back to our common ancestry with the chimps and bonobos, but still, it's the beginning. And that's quite a story. That is a story that's the 20th century story, because almost nothing was known before that, and we've learned a ton since. But then the next one is the really interesting one, and that's the future of us. After all, we have a script here, written in the fossil record, the genomic record, that kind of thing. We have come dangerously close to major extinctions, at least one around 950,000 years ago, and one 70,000 years ago in Indonesia, Mount Toba, and which estimates suggest that no more than 10,000 humans survived worldwide. Now you're safe when you're kind of dealing with the Americas, because there weren't any modern humans there, right? The earliest ones got down to New Mexico around 25,000 years ago. So it's a really interesting stuff. And then we'll deal with the tough one as the last. But I think it's important to have a background before you get into that kind of stuff, because you can get into a lot of trouble finding your way. Oh, don't you love the picture of him? I mean, he has that kind of bullish. But I was looking at the. I mean, there's a hole punch, right? Stuff, and pen stuff that we wouldn't have on a desk, and that looks like any English university and any English pretend university in the Commonwealth and the Empire before, leaded windows in every room and cold as hell. Yeah.
You would know it, the famous iconic picture of Churchill by Karsh.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know if other people know the reason why that happened like that.
Didn't they tell him? I'm making this, but didn't they tell him to take a cigar out?
He came over, Karsh, and took his cigar.
Oh, he took the cigar.
He took his cigar.
Well, that's
and
a better.
That is the iconic
That's a better
picture
story.
of Churchill. I'll stick to that story.
Yeah, well,
Churchill was the highest paid journalist in the late 1920s, 30s, when he was out of office.
yes, and he needed it.
Oh,
He didn't
God,
have
yes.
any money.
I don't know when he bought Chartwell, but I mean, you know, there was a lot of money to upkeep Chartwell.
Yeah,
There's a story where Churchill saved a boy's life. And that boy, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I can't think of how it went out, but it was an extraordinary story. That the boy's life he saved when they grew up, I forget what the connection was, but absolutely interesting.
It wasn't Duncan Sands, was it?
What was that name?
Duncan Sands?
No.
well, he was an extraordinary person, and, I mean, the last cavalry charge, he was in the last cavalry charge, and somehow survived.
Do you know, we're only talking about him here because of all the odd luck in the world. He rented the White Farmhouse during the Boer War. If he hadn't knocked on another door for refuge, they'd have handed him over to the Boers.
Yeah. And by the way, when he was in India,
Hmm?
in the Empire days, he read Darwin's books and really liked them. So this guy read widely. Yeah, that's really unusual.
Could I change the subject just
Yes.
for 1 minute?
Yes.
I'm having a hard time understanding the dating of anything you talk about. Is that
Yeah.
all called carbon dating, or is there, how?
Well, carbon dating is maybe accurate out to maybe 20 or 30,000 years, but if you look at a chart, and I'll bring the slide next week, but if
Oh,
you,
okay.
the radioactive ones, they all have very differing half-lives, and some of them, like carbon, is kind of maybe 10,000 years,
Okay,
something like that, and then it progressively loses its sensitivity the further down you go. But some of them have half-lives of 500 million years. So when we're talking about the, could life have existed 3.5 billion years ago?
Right.
They're using radioactive decay.
radioactive.
Using elements that have long,
Okay. that helps a
half-lives,
bit.
yeah.
Helps a bit.
and very precise ones, yeah.
I just find it
Yeah,
bothersome.
there is an issue though, with dating and genomic dating. Because you can also date, some genes are very stable and they have long lifetimes before a mutation happens, if you like, using the model of the isotope thing. So sometimes you find a disconnect between dating, migration, or if you've taken DNA from the inner ear or whatever source you've got, and then compare it to what else. And so these days, people they never just use a single way of doing it. They use multiple ways of doing
I'm
it.
kind of wondering how much of this I'm going to retain. I really am.
Well, no, it's really very interesting because a lot of this rests on that.
Yeah, true.
You know, how do we know 13.8
Yeah.
billion years ago? Well, based on a standard model.
Standard model.
Yeah, standard model, but the standard model, if you use the standard model, well, there should be, the earliest stars should have appeared, say, around 100 million years after. Now, that sounds like a long time to me, but 100 million years after the Big Bang. Now, the other thing is, after the Big Bang, there was a long silent period of about a third of a million years. And why was that? Because it was so bloody hot that no light quanta could actually get out of this dense plasmic soup. And so the universe was actually dark, and only when the temperature had dropped to the point when protons could combine with electrons was light then free to actually, so that's what's often called first light in the universe. and that's 385,000 years after Big Bang. But, you know, there's what preceded the Big Bang? What's the eventual fate of the universe, if you're a fan of Roger Penrose? I mean, I do think theoretical physicists love to speculate, and based on their math. But it's not implausible. What he says is, okay, clearly there had to be something before. It didn't happen out of nothing. And, well, what was the something? Well, where are we headed now? Well, so his postulate is that as the universe expands, and we're still expanding and accelerating, the expansion is actually accelerating. But at some point, depending on which school you're talking to, the universe may begin to collapse again, or it be larger and larger black holes form. They merge into one single gigantic gargantuan black hole containing all the energy, all that would be in the universe in that black hole, and then that collapses into a singularity, and you're back to the Big Bang.
A grain of sand or something.
Now, is anyone going to actually know that anytime? No. But what is stunning, I mean, stuff does stand out. It's clear that there is a visual limit to the universe beyond which we cannot see. And so it's much more enormous than we think. And the other thing, as I said, the traffic speed is 300,000 kilometers per second, or the speed of light. And so far, nothing's beaten that, and despite Star Trek. And yeah,
Can I ask you a question about the radioactivity?
yeah.
You know, you have a radioactive element and it has a half-life of like 1 million years or something. But so let's take an atom of uranium. I
Right.
don't know how many protons, the number it is, like 80 or whatever, it's way up there. Okay, let's say it's got 90 electrons, protons, and neutrons in it. And it's shooting these things off all the time. That little tiny one atom is shooting off particles. Now, after it shoots off 80, how can it still go on for millions of years?
Oh, because the rate at which it's doing that is very, very slow.
No, I'm saying that you've got this marble that's made up of 80 little marbles inside. It shoots them off. Once those 80 are gone, why is there anything left?
Well, there might not be anything left.
Yeah, but it's shooting those off at a rate, constant rate, tick, 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 for millions of years. How can that be possible?
Because the overall rate is actually very slow.
No, it doesn't matter how slow or fast it is, it's the number.
No, it's not just the number. It's what is the probability of a proton escaping the nucleus? And some forms of uranium are they're unstable. There are several forms of uranium, as you probably know, and they have different half-lives, and they're a reflection of the stability of the uranium. And I mean, that's where our most precise clock comes from, isn't it?
Yeah.
The atomic clock. It's really based on the same thing.
But it's so funny though, because you can take the smallest, tiniest piece of uranium, and that thing is shooting off particles for millions of years. That one little tiny thing is shooting off for millions. How can it have that many particles in there to shoot them off for that long?
There's a lot of them. Do the numbers there. We can do the inverse flip of the number of habitable planets here with the number of particles, particularly neutrons or protons in a nucleus. I mean, they're staggering numbers. They're really staggering numbers. Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, Ross. Okay. So next week, we're on to human evolution. Then the following week, our future. And this is just a hint. This is one of my, I got to know this John Gurche guy. He had a cerebellar malignant tumor in, I think, 2012, 2011, something like that, which he had it excised. I gather he's fine now. But he's the fellow who creates these look-alike things from fossils, and he does it for the Smithsonian, and does a beautiful job. And he wrote, within 2 or 3 years of the discovery of that cancer, a wonderful book, and full of illustrations of his productions, kind of like your paper dresses. It really is. The analogy is very similar to what Rita's done, and with a different object. But anyway, but so he has speculated about this. I don't know where we are right now, but he's a very imaginative guy. I'll just share this one little story with you, and you can leave before that, of course. But he imagined if you went back 100,000 generations, figure that out, that'd be about 3 million years ago. No, about 2 million years ago. Go back. Depends on what a generation is. I mean, I would think it's fairly short because sex started with puberty, and when the eggs first started, I don't think they were fiddling around. And but in any case, whatever the estimate is, so he thought, well, I wonder what life was like at that time. And he would have known all the characters in the play. And without ever saying so, he's talking about Homo erectus. Erectus was the first tall, kind of almost human-like. If he was on the street with a suit on, he might look like us, maybe a little odd, but not a lot. And longer legs, shorter arms, that kind of thing, a skull about the same size or almost the same size. Anyway, so he imagined a group by a river, and it was maybe an hour before dusk, and this person, he doesn't tell us in the story, but something happened, and he drowned. And ordinarily the group came around and tried to help him, but it was getting dark, and their predators come out at night, so they left him. And it wasn't the custom to bury him anyway. The body is carried by the river downstream, and over many, many thousands of years, sediment was deposited on top of the body, and he became mineralized. And then the land began to heave underneath him, the Great Rift Valley in Africa. If you like, what is it, Out of Africa, the movie. Remember some of the scenes of the Great Rift Valley. And many of these fossils were discovered after heavy rainstorms, kind of washing away debris. And so the scene is, now there's a being here, the skull, hears voices, and they're very strange voices. And they don't look like anything that he's aware of, and he doesn't know what they're doing. And they spot him, and they get all excited. Of course, they found a fossil, a significant one. And so he, in his mind, and one of the modern humans pokes his fingers in his orbits, and it was almost both were alive. Do you follow what I'm saying? And it's a wonderful way of thinking about it. And he will tell you that in the creation of these bodies, I think I mentioned this last week, it was all in the eyes. They weren't alive until the eyes went in, and then they became alive. And then for the rest of the time that he worked with them, he always had this feeling that there was something, that this thing he was working on was alive. Something about it. These took months in the creation. He was many hours doing this kind of stuff, and I thought, gee, that's a really interesting. And then he turns it around at the end of the book, and he says, now, what could happen to us? He's very familiar with our past, much more so than I am. He knows most of the characters quite well. And so he, with that in mind, what's in our future based on our past? So if you take the past as prologue for the future, what is our future? No species, no Homo species, has lasted any longer than maybe 500,000 years, with one exception, Homo erectus. And they've made a mistake in that because Homo erectus clearly changed a lot in that 1.7 million years. So it's really many species. But no species has lasted longer than that. And before significant changes, enough to, and the speed of evolution is actually increasing. The rate at which we're changing is increasing. So anyway, something to think about. So will we be around?
I think we better get to Mars and start living on Mars and get that terraformed.
No. You know why? Because,
Radiation.
well, no.
Radiation.
You know why? Well, because our sun is set to kind of end its life in about, well, however many billion years from now. And when it does, it will do what stars its size does, expand to include a kind of a bubble of enormous temperatures of a size large enough to certainly engulf Earth and incinerate Earth and maybe Mars. Now you say, where the hell did they get that information from? Because if you study, you can study the same events that have happened already by looking back in the solar system. You can recognize, if you just put the pieces together and figure it out, you realize that's what happened. So anyway, on to next week.
Jim, we should go out tonight, have fun, we haven't got much time left.
Anyway,
Yeah, have fun right now. Your time is running out.
I remember